A group of Cuban Americans are calling on President Biden to support the current uprising against the communist government. This morning, our Joe St. George joins us live from Washington, D.C. to tell us more about the evolving situation. Joe, good morning. Thank you, as always, for joining us. I want to dive right in by asking what initially started these protests and why did they begin?
Well, you know, this all really began on the island nation of Cuba, in which we saw a few weeks back unprecedented protests, if you will, as a direct result of economic conditions, but also as a direct result of COVID-19. Cuba was struggling with their vaccine rollout. People were getting sick, and as a result, people were frustrated. They were frustrated with the lack of money. They were frustrated with their lack of progress when it came to the pandemic. So that's where this uprising really started, and it was really carried on in places like Texas and places like Florida by Cuban communities who remain frustrated at the communist government in Havana, Cuba. Where it has transpired in the last 48 hours is that the protests, which have been largely in the United States and in Cuban neighborhoods, they've traveled here to Washington, D.C. So caravans from Texas have traveled here to our nation's capital, holding rallies, holding protests outside the White House, demanding that President Biden do more. Now, what does do more mean? It varies from protester to protester. Some want military intervention. Some say they simply want internet access. Some want more humanitarian aid. So there's a little bit of confusion as to whether or not what exactly all of these caravans from places like Texas, Florida, have come to outside the White House to advocate for. But one thing is clear, they want change, and they believe now is the time for change in the island nation of Cuba.
Now, what policies, if any, have changed since these protests have started in the nation's capital?
There has been sanctions leveled against the Cuban government, more sanctions leveled against the Cuban government as a result of kind of the effort by the government to end these protests in Cuba. But as far as drastic policies, there hasn't been anything that has certainly risen to the level that has satisfied the protesters. If they were satisfied with what the president, what the State Department was doing, there certainly wouldn't have been this very organic movement to some degree to travel here to D.C., to stand outside the White House in hot temperatures, mind you, and demand change. So, as I said, every group, every protester seems to want something different. It looks different for everyone, but change is what they want. Whether they get it, I think it's still too early to tell. There's a lot of issues on the president's plate, from infrastructure to the economy to now the pandemic. Cuba wasn't necessarily at the top of that list until the protests began a few weeks back.